Hi there.
Hi, okay. Thanks for all the tweeting and questioning, and now it's your turn to be on the receiving end. So I'll just move one click here, and you should be able to grab control, and the floor will be yours.
All right, great. All right, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Annie Pettit, and I am the Chief Research Officer of Conversation. We're a market research company that specializes in social media listening research. So what you're going to hear today from me are the top 5 tricks we've learned over the years that will give you the best research results possible. So let's get right to it. All right, the first trick of the trade really isn't a trick. It's not new, it's not surprising, it's really quite simple. Every social media listening research project should start with a research objective. It's something you do with every survey project, every focus group project, every mobile research project. This is simply what you need to do to get your research program started. There are a number of objectives we're quite familiar with, and they range from things like usage and attitude studies, segmentation work, custom research projects. Based on those objectives, you design the appropriate research instrument, whether it's a survey or a discussion guide, and all of your analysis techniques have that specific objective in mind. Strangely, though, this is often not what happens in social media listening research. This is what I often see in listening research. People don't actually have a research objective. They simply want to see what social media listening data looks like. You might wonder what's so bad about that. Well, let's imagine you've got a 50-page survey and you found 500,000 people to answer it. Now, of course, you have no research objective, so what are you going to do? What's going to happen is you will meander through hundreds of pages of crosstabs. You'll see something weird over there, something strange over here, and something really neat somewhere else. And 3 weeks later, you're going to realize you've wasted 3 weeks staring at a bunch of numbers and you've progressed nowhere. So sure, you've learned lots of interesting things, but they don't create a cohesive brand strategy. They don't solve any of your brand problems. You haven't gotten any further ahead. So jumping into social media research without a research objective is no different. It's a recipe for failure. It's a tasty recipe, yes, but it's still a failure. The alternative is to have a research objective. And just like traditional research, there are plenty to choose from. It could be as simple as determining whether people like the new advertising campaign you've launched on TV. Do they like the spokesperson? Do they like the background music? Are they sharing the YouTube version of the commercial with everyone? Or are they super annoyed with the commercial's tagline? The objective could be something like, is Facebook a good place to advertise my product? So in this case, you could evaluate all the different websites where messages about your brand exist, determine the sentiment towards your brand on each of the different websites, and then calibrate your message for each of those websites. For example, if Facebook fans like to talk about the color of your product, then you might want to focus your Facebook messaging on the color. And if Twitter fans like to talk about the size of your product, you might want to focus your Twitter messages on the size. So once you know your research objective, your analysis plan becomes very straightforward and you can complete your research much more quickly. Let's move on to the second important tip. All right. Before stepping into the research process, you need to know if it's even possible to do. Despite the fact that you live and eat and breathe your brand, not everyone else on the planet does. Surprisingly, not everyone else is writing sonnets about your products in social media. So let's consider the types of brands that are best suited for social media listening research. Let's talk about which types of brands can conduct which kinds of research. At the top of the Fortune 500 list are companies pulling in more than $25 billion in revenue every single year. It's impressive. You would think that everyone knows exactly who these companies are and exactly what products and services they provide. But I suspect that as you look through this list, you realize you don't know all of these companies and you don't know all the products they produce. But is that surprising? Do you really know which companies make the plastic, the steel, the paper you use every day? Do you really know which company made the table you're sitting at, the chair you're sitting in, or the mouse pad you're using? I really doubt it. So why should these kinds of companies be surprised when there aren't any conversations about them in social media? These aren't the kinds of companies that can take advantage of social media listening research to learn more about how consumers feel about their brand. It's just not going to happen. What these brands have to do is measure their well-known competitors or even the category. How do consumers talk about insurance, healthcare, safety? These category topics are very measurable in social media. Now, on the other hand, there are some other serious money makers out there. I'm pretty sure everyone knows Johnson & Johnson, PepsiCo, Merck, Unilever, DuPont. These are essentially household names that everyone has heard of before. But if you really think about it, you don't talk about these companies. You don't really care about the overarching company. You care more about the products they make. The Neutrogena skincare products, the Pepsi beverage, the Claritin allergy medication. If you're going to talk about any brand, it's going to be the consumer brand, not the parent brand. So once again, you may not be able to measure these brands directly simply because they aren't consumer-facing brands. You'll have to focus on category, competitive, or sub-brand measurements. Here's another option. I love talking about Annie's Bakery. When I retire from market research with millions of dollars in the bank and open the bakery I've always wanted, I'll have my own storefront. You'll be able to find me on Google Maps. You might even see some online reviews of my most wonderful bakery. But who is really talking about my bakery online? There's probably only a few hundred people who would live within a mile or two of my shop. And how many of those people will actually come into the bakery, buy something, and then go online to talk about it? I'm guessing about 3 people. So even though I love my bakery and desperately want to research consumer opinions about it, that's just not going to happen. And along those lines, it means that the local college, the local spa, the local coffee shop, none of these brands will be able to research themselves either. Fortunately, smaller brands like these can still take full advantage of social media and do research on the well-known competitive brands. And of course, they can also do research on the category to learn more about how people talk about coffee shops or spas or college in general. So if all of those companies can't do social media listening research on their own brand, who can? It really does come down to larger consumer-facing brands. I bet everyone knows all of these brands. Chances are you've bought several of them yourselves, maybe even within just the past few weeks. And chances are, if you're an avid social media user, you might have even mentioned one of these brands online in the last year. So the question comes down to this. How do you know which brands are best suited to measure consumer opinions about their own brand? For me, it comes down to this. Imagine yourself sitting in a coffee shop with a couple of your best friends. you're having a fun conversation, talking about going to the movies, going shopping on the weekend, spending time with your family. And amongst that conversation, which brand names are going to pop up? Those are the brands that are perfect for measuring consumer opinions. Those are the brands that can measure not only the category opinions and the competitive opinions, but also opinions about the brand itself. So the moral of the story is this. Anytime you gear up to do social media research, remind yourself about the kinds of brands that consumers want to talk about, and consider if the brand you're working with is one of those. Then, be prepared to focus on category or competitive data if your brand isn't the best candidate to measure opinions about themselves. All right, tip number 3. Once again, there is nothing shocking or new here, but it's something we run into all the time with social media listening research. Just because it's not survey data, just because it's a different kind of data set that you've never worked with before, does not mean you can ignore everything you've ever learned about conducting rigorous quality research. Let's look at this first example. In the world of social media listening research, you sometimes have these ridiculous sample sizes. You might be used to working with 700 completes from a survey project, but now imagine working with 2 million completes instead. If you're working with a brand like Apple or Nike or Walmart, these kinds of ridiculously huge sample sizes are common. In the survey world, if you found an interesting result, you would run a chi-square or a t-test to determine if the difference you see in those results is statistically significant. But when it comes to listening research, you don't need to run a significance test. These huge sample sizes mean that essentially every single difference you see is statistically significant, even the minuscule difference you see here. You can't even see the difference in the bar chart, but it is indeed statistically significant. It comes down to this. When the sample sizes are huge, you actually need to forget about significance testing and use your brain. You need to understand that significance testing by itself does not answer every problem. You need to become familiar with effect size testing. In other words, is the difference you see meaningful? Is the difference large enough for you to consider taking action? So would you really create a different marketing strategy for men and women based on this statistically significant difference of 0.2 points? I highly doubt it. Now, on the other hand, there are many cases in listening research where small sample sizes do come into play. Because we can read individual verbatims from real people, it's very easy to lose track of the overriding issues that affect hundreds or thousands of people. It's really easy to focus on 1 or 2 or 5 people and get carried away with individual stories. In the example you see here, the sample sizes are far too small to generate any statistical significance. Does that mean you should not pay attention to the differences you see? Well, of course not. Once again, you need to use your brain. You need to consider whether someone's comment is simply a one-off statement or a problem that could quickly escalate into a PR nightmare. If you see 3 comments about a lawsuit or about a defect in the braking system of a car, forget statistical significance. You need to act quickly. On to tip number 4. Now that I've just finished saying don't forget everything you learned about research basics and statistics, I'm going to follow that up by saying be prepared to forego some of your research basics. Surveys and focus group research have put us in the position where we expect certain things. But with social media research, sometimes you just need to stop looking for things that aren't there to begin with. For instance, when was the last time you saw a tweet or a Facebook status update that included the person's age, gender, income, education, household size, number of children, race, religion, and language? I am going to guess on your behalf and say none. If you're a Facebook user, you know that there are places to provide some of this information, and you might have even given answers for some of them. But that doesn't mean Facebook chooses to share all that information outside of Facebook. And the same thing goes for Twitter. At best, there are spaces to say what country you live in, your age, your gender, but most people do not fill out those boxes. So what it means is that the vast majority of social media opinions do not come with any demographic information. We don't know if the person who hates McDonald's is a man or a woman, has kids or no kids, is old or young. We just don't know. So if you really need to know demographic information, then social media listening research may not suit your needs. You might actually need to run a survey. And here is the last tip, tip number 5. Every researcher has a favorite methodology. Just a few years ago, I was all about online surveys. I could talk for hours about online surveys and data quality. I could solve every problem using an online survey. But if you talk to me now, I can answer every problem with social media research. But really, that's not the best way to carry out research. The best method truly is a multi-mode method. So here I would like to introduce the Mickey Mouse Triad of Excellence. The point here is that once you've decided on the methodology that is best suited to answering your question, you should not stop there. By incorporating other methodologies, you can gain the best of every world. For instance, you might decide that listening research is the best way to gather hundreds of psychographic data points about your brand. But you want to ensure that you have some census rep information as well. And that's where surveys come in with all of the age, gender, education, and income information. And then you might also decide that you need to learn about the purchase point of contact. And that's where mobile research comes into play. By combining these 3 methodologies together, you get a much fuller, more representative picture of what's happening with your brand. You don't need to have holes in your research if you plan ahead. And those, my friends, are the 5 tips that will generate the best possible listening research results. It really comes down to remembering that you are a researcher and you must uphold the standards and rigor that you always apply to your research, whether it's survey research, social media listening research, or some other kind of research. Thank you very much.